You need to know what's basically the pillars of a buying and selling transaction before you even engage in it, and
That's right.
understanding what shares we can get into and what we can't get into.
That's right. So that's why one of the key, before we get into shares, and I think it's one of the, I always like to introduce a very basic, what is a selling transaction is Islam? How does Islam view it? So basically I like to summarize it in 5 key elements. The ulama basically have many different categorizations of what are the pillars of a buy and sell. But I think the one that would help us in our discussions is these 5 pillars. You have the buyer. You have in any transaction, and a buy-sell transaction, you have a buyer, you have a seller, you have the price, the compensation that is paid for the product, you have the product itself, and then you have something very beautiful called the sigha, this expression of offer and acceptance. So some scholars, they say that, look, the sigha is in 2 categories. So they categorize it as buying and accepting as 2 different categories. Some scholars say, look, sigha is one whole thing, this expression. And normally, subhanallah, the reason why I like to categorize it like this and to explain it to people like this, even before we buy shares, is because, number one, normally the first pillar is straightforward. You have a buyer. And everyone's a buyer, and that's very typical. You have a seller. That's very typical as well. You expect a buyer, you expect a seller. You have the price. Yes, that's also very typical. But then in the last 2 things, what you're paying for in the product and the expression of offer and acceptance are the most critical parts of many transactions today. So if you look at any sort of Islamic finance transaction or any sort of day-to-day transaction that you have, you pass it through these 5 key elements. Normally the key problems are, and many of the discussions and the scholarly articles are written in regards to the product that you're buying and the expression that's used to buying it. For example, I can say, I sell you this cup of water for free. Yani, that's why the expression is important. What does that mean? So then the scholars will look at that. Okay, that technically means is a gift. And then some scholars say, no, you can't sell something for free. That becomes invalid in a sale contract. You should enter this, what you just did, into the chapter of a gift. So you should call it a gift, right? And then likewise, vice versa, right? I want to give you this car for $10, So that's why this expression is very, and then some scholars say, look, that is actually, such a contract is upheld under a sale contract, but you can't actually call it a gift contract. So this expression, subhanAllah, is a very important part of the contract, and is also an important part, one of the major points of differentiation and argument and debate in many sort of Islamic contracts. How are you expressing, how are you transacting this product? And also the other part is the product itself. What are you buying? I think, and this is relevant to our discussion now, because what are you buying here? You're essentially buying a share, right? So in any share type purchase, you have the buyer, you have someone selling the share, you have the price paid for the share, you have the share itself, and then you have the offer and acceptance. I buy you this share for $10, I accept, that share is transacted. Now this share in itself, now the scholars then look at this and say, okay, subhanallah, is this share, what you're selling, is it permissible? And subhanallah, that's
another issue altogether.
That's the ikhtilaf, and that's hopefully what we'll get into today.